The titans of old were stirring once again, ready to reclaim their place in a world that had grown cold. I was handed Daniel's old laptop like it was nothing more than a bag of old newspapers bound for the curb. "He would have wanted you to have this," my daughter-in-law said, already turning back toward her car, the one that cost more than I made in 6 months at the mill. Her smile wasn't grief. It was satisfaction. I wanted to know where my viewers were watching from today, so I imagined asking, "Have you ever been given something that everyone else thought was worthless, only to discover it contained the power to change everything?" That old laptop my son left me was exactly that. Daniel's memorial service had been on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after a search and rescue team recovered his backpack and one hiking boot from the base of a ravine in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. No body. The terrain was too rugged, the fall too severe. After 14 days of searching, the authorities had closed the active search. They called it a tragic accident, closure. I called it the worst morning of my 63 years. Daniel was 41. He'd been a software architect for a cybersecurity firm in Denver, building something from nothing the same way I'd built our house in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, one nail at a time. He had his mother's eyes and my stubbornness, and he called me every Sunday without fail. Even after Margaret passed, even when he traveled, even when life became busy, every single Sunday call arrived until the last one never came. After the service, Nicole hosted a reception at the house on Ridgemont Drive, the house Daniel had bought with a decade of 7-day work weeks. She wore a dress that didn't look like mourning to me, but what do I know about fashion? I know steel beams and junction boxes, and the way a good man carries himself. My son had carried himself well. The lawyer read the will in Nicole's living room, 30 people present. I sat in the back corner near the fireplace, the same fireplace Daniel and I had installed together the winter he bought the place. I remembered him handing me a level, laughing because I insisted the old ways were better than his laser-guided gadget. The house went to Nicole. The investment accounts, stock portfolio, life insurance, worth $4 million, all to Nicole. His personal effects, engineering awards, the framed photo of us at Steelers training camp, all to Nicole to distribute as she saw fit. Then, to his father, Raymond Calloway, the attorney read without looking up. Daniel leaves his personal laptop and the external hard drive stored in his home office with the instruction that his father go through the files at his own pace. I heard my neighbor clear his throat. I heard Daniel's old college roommate shift in his chair. "In our part of Pennsylvania, you took care of your parents. You didn't hand your father a used computer while your wife walked away with $4 million. The discomfort in that room was thick enough to cut." Nicole crossed the room after the attorney finished and placed the laptop on my knees like completing a transaction. The external hard drive was tucked in a cloth bag. "I hope there's something meaningful on there for you," she said. "You know how Daniel was about sentimental things." I thanked her. I didn't make a scene. Margaret always said I was the most stubborn man she had ever loved, but also the most patient. And in that moment, patience felt like the only tool I had left. My neighbor Carol drove me home. She had insisted, since Margaret died 2 years ago, on casseroles, rides to the pharmacy, someone to sit with on the porch when evenings got too quiet. She didn't speak much on the drive, just kept one hand near mine in case I needed it. That's the kind of people we had in this town. I set the laptop on the kitchen table and didn't touch it for 4 days. On the 5th day, I made coffee, sat in my reading chair, and opened it. The screen came to life. Daniel's desktop background was a photo of the two of us at the rim of the Grand Canyon, squinting into the Arizona sun. He looked maybe 35. I barely recognized the man who still believed the world was mostly fair. I wasn't much for computers. Daniel had spent years trying to drag me into the modern age, the same patient way I had taught him to wire a 3-way switch. I clicked through his folders slowly. Work files I didn't understand, photos organized by year, music from Sunday calls. Then I found a folder with no name, just a small padlock icon different from everything else. A password prompt appeared. I tried Margaret's birthday. Wrong. Daniel's birthday. Wrong. Our childhood address on Garfield Street. Wrong. Then the date Daniel and I drove to Pittsburgh to watch Roberto Clemente's number get retired at 3 Rivers. He had been 12. The folder opened. Inside was a single video labeled with my name. My hand shook as I pressed play. "Dad." His voice came out of the speakers, and I stopped breathing entirely. His face filled the screen, slightly underlit, sitting in a dim room. He looked tired and thinner, but unmistakably him. the scar above his left eyebrow from his bicycle accident at 9. The way he pressed his lips together before saying something important. Dad, if you're watching this, it means you found the folder. You're exactly as stubborn and curious as I counted on. I need you to listen before doing anything. What I'm about to tell you will be hard to hear, and some of it will make you angry. But I need your help, not the help of a grieving man, the help of the smartest, most patient man I've ever known. He leaned forward. I'm alive, Dad. I pressed pause, sat in the kitchen for 3 minutes, hands flat on the table, the same way I used to sit after mill layoffs, accidents, the kind of news that demanded stillness. Then I pressed play. I know what you're feeling. I know because I know you. But please keep listening. I didn't have a choice, and I'm deeply sorry for what I put you through. What I'm going to show you in this folder, the documents, recordings, photographs, is why I had to disappear. They tried to kill me, Dad. If I hadn't faked that accident, they would have succeeded. There were more files. I opened them one by one as Daniel's video guided me. The first was an audio recording. Nicole's voice, calm and unhurried, talking to a man named Brett. I recognized Brett Larkin, her co-worker, a man I'd met twice at company parties and found unremarkable. The recording was dated 6 weeks before Daniel's hiking trip. The life insurance pays out double for accidental death, Nicole said. 4 million becomes 8 if we do this right. Brett's voice followed. We'd need to make sure there's no body. Rocky Mountain terrain. Nicole's tone was chillingly deliberate. The search teams won't push too hard if conditions are bad enough, and I'll make sure conditions are bad enough. He always hikes alone up there. Always. I had to stop the video twice, my fists clenching, the anger rising. The second file was a series of bank transfers, Nicole's account receiving deposits from Brett's firm, each amount small enough to avoid automatic flagging. The third was a text thread, screenshotted and dated, showing the two of them involved for nearly a year. The fourth was a photograph of Daniel's hiking pack, the one recovered by search and rescue, showing a deliberate tear in the hydration bladder designed to cause slow dehydration over a long day at high altitude. Not enough to stop a man immediately, but enough to disorient him near a ledge. He survived because of luck, and 30 years of his father telling him to carry a backup water source. Dad, Daniel said in the video, I found out about the affair 2 months before the trip. When I started digging, I found the financial transfers. When I had those, I installed a recording app. Once I had the recordings, I realized I had maybe one option that didn't end with me disappearing anyway except on their terms, not mine. I staged the scene myself. The backpack, the boot, the distress signals consistent with a fall. The terrain up there is genuinely unforgiving. Search teams stop after 2 weeks in those conditions. Heartbreaking, yes, but I knew they would. I hiked out through the next valley overnight and made my way to a place nobody would think to look. A friend from my first job owns property in West Virginia near Seneca Rocks. He's been in Singapore for 2 years. He gave me the access code for emergencies. I think this qualifies. Daniel almost smiled at his own joke. Almost. He gave the address in the video. He said he'd been there for 3 weeks, waiting, hoping I'd find the folder before giving up. I waited until after 9 p.m. and drove to Carol's back door, telling her I needed a few days in the mountains, time to think. She studied my face the way she had for 40 years. You look like a man with a plan, she said. Just a man who needs the mountains, I told her. She packed a container of leftover beef stew without asking. Some people show love in words. Carol shows it in food. I drove south through the night, Maryland into West Virginia, following roads I'd never taken. They narrowed the further I went. By the time I was within an hour of the property, cell service was gone entirely. The November hills had the heavy, ancient look of a land holding up the sky since before anyone had a name for anything. The property was at the end of a dirt road that had seen better decades. A farmhouse, 2 stories, with a deep front porch. A barn leaned slightly east. A light shone in a downstairs window. A truck I didn't recognize was parked by the fence. I sat in my car, every rational part of my mind running through explanations. Grief distorts perception. Sleep deprivation distorts perception. 3 weeks of casseroles, condolence cards, and hearing that he was in a better place distort perception. Then the front door opened. My son walked onto the porch. Thinner, a beard I'd never seen before, wearing a flannel jacket that looked borrowed. But the way he stood on that step, hands at his sides, cautious, yet hopeful that was Daniel. I got out of the car. We stood 20 feet apart in the dark, searching for words. Then he said, "Dad." His voice cracked the way it did when he was 16, calling from the hospital after his first car accident. Scared, embarrassed, relieved to hear my voice. I crossed the 20 feet and held my son for a long time, long enough to feel him solid, real and alive, long enough to stop fearing he'd disappear again. Inside, he had turned the farmhouse dining table into an evidence board from a detective show. Printed records, highlighted bank statements, a timeline running along the wall on yellow legal paper. My son, the software architect, processing a problem the only way he knew, systematically. "I want to be angry at you," I said. "I've been angry for 3 weeks without knowing it." "I know, Dad." He sat across from me, hands flat on the table. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making this right, but right now I need to know you're with me. I can't do the next part alone." I told him everything. He spoke for 2 hours, the way I used to listen when he was small, working through something too big for his years. No interruption, no solutions, just being the fixed point around which he could navigate the chaos. The affair had started at a company retreat 18 months ago. Brett wasn't just a co-worker. He was a silent partner in a financial consulting firm under federal investigation for wire fraud. Nicole had been helping him move money. Daniel discovered the irregularities during a security audit, tracing threads that implicated his own financial records. They weren't just trying to kill him for insurance. They were trying to eliminate him before he could testify to something he didn't even know he'd witnessed. "What do we do?" I asked. "We do what you always taught me," Daniel said. "You don't fight a fire by running at it. You cut off the oxygen." He had been carefully in contact with a federal investigator building a case against Brett's firm for 11 months. Daniel had encrypted copies of everything: the transfers, altered records, recordings, and had already passed a portion to the investigator. But for Daniel to return as a living man required coordination, a controlled appearance, witnessed, leaving Nicole and Brett no time to fabricate a narrative. That's where I came in. We stayed up until almost 3 a.m. at the farmhouse table, planning the way we used to approach big projects together. Him with technical precision, me with the understanding of human behavior under perceived control. I knew Nicole. I had watched her at family dinners for 6 years. I knew the exact shape of her confidence, where its edges lay. I drove home the next afternoon, arriving back in Bethlehem, and went straight to Carol's porch to tell her I was back, feeling more like myself than I had in weeks. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Nicole. I called her back. "Raymond," she said, "I heard from Carol that you took a trip. Are you doing all right?" "Better than I have in a while," I said. "Actually, I've been going through Daniel's laptop, some of those old files. It's like spending time with him again. You know how he kept everything." There was a pause. "Oh," she said. "That's sweet," I said, keeping my voice easy, warm. "There's a file on here. Looks like Daniel wanted to share something with family. I can't make heads or tails of the technical side, but maybe you and Brett could come by Saturday evening, and we could look through it together. I know you and Brett have grown close since the service. Grief does that." The pause was longer. "Of course," she said finally. "That sounds lovely." I told her 7 p.m. I told her to bring Brett. Saturday afternoon, I drove to the hardware store and bought nothing. What I actually did was meet briefly in the parking lot with a man named Agent Daly, who had driven up from Philadelphia. He carried the quiet, competent manner of someone who had been doing difficult things calmly for a very long time. He asked me 3 questions. I answered them. He nodded and said to keep everything as normal as possible. Carol came over at 5 p.m. to help set out coffee cups and a plate of cookies neither of us expected anyone to eat. That evening, she finally asked directly, the way only a longtime friend could, "Is Daniel alive?" I looked at her over the kitchen counter. "I need you to stay calm and stay in the house," I told her. She put her hand over her mouth, eyes filled, nodded, and sat at the kitchen table. Exactly the right response. Nicole arrived at 7 p.m. with Brett, a half step behind her. He was younger than I remembered at company parties, early 40s, someone who had spent time and money on his appearance without it quite working. He shook my hand with a firmness that felt strategic. "Raymond," Nicole said, kissing my cheek, "you look well. Come in." I guided them to the living room. The laptop was open on the coffee table, angled toward the couch. Brett glanced at it briefly, looked away, expecting the worst. Nicole settled in. You said there were some files Daniel was working on. There are, I said. I sat in my armchair, the same chair I had used for 40 years of family evenings. Going through that laptop has been eye-opening. You learn a lot about a person by seeing what they saved. Brett shifted slightly. That's the thing about engineers, he said. They keep everything. Really, they do. I leaned forward. Actually, the file I want to show you isn't something I can pull up myself. I need technical help. But first, I wanted someone to walk us through it. Then my son walked into his own living room. Nicole made a sound I had never heard from a human being before and hoped never to hear again. The coffee cup in her hand dropped onto the rug, and she stood so fast she knocked the edge of the table. Brett turned the color of old concrete and lunged toward the front door. It opened before he reached it. Agent Daly and 2 other federal agents entered from the front, 2 more through the kitchen. Carol was already on the porch with Frank Drowski and 3 other neighbors who had seen the federal vehicles. Understanding this moment required witnesses. Nicole Parker, Agent Daly said, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and obstruction of a federal investigation." Brett Larkin, "You're under arrest on 6 counts of federal wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempted murder." Nicole turned to Daniel, face going through something complicated, settling into cold stillness. "You're supposed to be dead," she said. Daniel looked at her as if analyzing corrupted code, calm, moving past the problem, focused on the solution. "You should have known better than to underestimate a man whose father taught him to always have a backup plan," he said. They were led out past Carol, who quietly cried on the porch railing. Neighbors stood in the cold November evening, witnessing something they would describe to grandchildren. When it was over, Daniel and I stood in the kitchen while Carol made a fresh pot of coffee. Frank had gone home but promised to return in the morning. Agent Daly explained in patient, thorough terms what the next several weeks would look like. The legal process of reversing a death declaration, cooperating with the federal investigation, dealing with the insurance company. It would be complicated. It would take time. Daniel looked at me across the kitchen counter. "Dad," he said, "I don't even know how to start thanking you." "You start by calling me every Sunday," I told him. He laughed. The best sound I had heard since the last time I heard it. I learned something important from this. A man my age knows grief is a weight that bends you if carried alone. What kept me from breaking in those 3 weeks wasn't strength. I'm not that proud, it was curiosity. It was the stubborn refusal to believe that an old laptop was all my son had left to give me. 40 years of knowing the most important things are rarely where everyone else is looking. I have learned betrayal at that scale, with the face of someone you welcomed into your family, carries a cruelty that doesn't fade quickly. I am still processing it, and will for some time. But the Lord does not waste suffering. He used it to put me in that chair with that laptop. He used my stubbornness to make sure I tried every password until the right one opened the right door. He used my patience, the patience Margaret teased me about, to sit in that farmhouse and listen to my son for 2 hours before saying a single word. Daniel and I have been rebuilding. Slower than I expected, better than I hoped. We spent Thanksgiving at Carol's house. The whole block crowded the way it used to be when the kids were small, and nobody had anywhere more important to be. He comes back to Bethlehem on weekends. We've started working on an old Jeep I found at an estate sale. Nothing structural, mostly rust and electrical, which happens to be my area of expertise. He sits across the engine, hands me tools, tells me I'm doing it wrong. I tell him I was doing it this way before his father was born. The garage sounds more like itself than it has in years. Sometimes the most important inheritance a man leaves his child isn't money or property. It's the specific kind of trust that says, "Follow this wherever it leads." I put something there worth finding, and I believe in your patience enough to know you will. Daniel believed in mine, and I would follow that man's voice through any mountain range on earth. If this story reached something in you about family, faith, or the stubborn refusal to accept the wrong ending, share it with someone who needs it today. If you've ever had a moment where what looked like nothing turned out to be everything, tell it in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else is waiting to hear.